Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, I invite you to lean back, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you into a story that is as unsettling as it is real. This is not a ghost tale or a legend passed around in whispers. It is the story of a man who prowled San Francisco in the mid-1970s, armed with a sketch pad, a smile, and a knife. A man who lured others in by promising a drawing, a moment of connection, only to end their lives in silence. He became known as the Doodler. His killings haunted the gay community of San Francisco, and his shadow has never fully left the city. To this day, despite a suspect being identified, no one has ever been held accountable. And that is the chilling truth we are about to explore. San Francisco in the 1970s was alive, vibrant, and dangerous in equal measure. The Castro district was becoming a safe haven for gay men, a neighborhood where people could breathe more freely than in most parts of America at the time. But it was also a place watched closely by those who despised that freedom. Violence against gay men was common, often ignored or minimized by police. And within this fragile sense of safety, a killer began to strike. I picture the city the way it must have been on those cool nights. Fog rolling off the Pacific, dim street lamps glowing in a damp mist, neon signs buzzing over late-night bars. People mingled in clubs, parks, and diners. To the men who became his victims, San Francisco was a place of hope, maybe even liberation. But their paths would cross with someone who saw them not as equals, not as humans searching for connection, but as prey. The first confirmed murder came in January 1974. But before we dive into that specific night, I want you to sit with the unease of knowing what these men did not. That somewhere among them, in the Castro bars or the parks by the ocean, was someone who carried a knife and a sketch pad. Someone who was waiting for a smile, a gesture of trust, before taking it all away. When you think of the 1970s, you might imagine disco music, bright colors, and political movements. San Francisco had all of that. Yet beneath the energy and joy, it was also a time when many men lived double lives. They had to. Some had families who didn't know they were gay. Others had jobs or reputations that would be ruined if their truth became public. This secrecy, this forced silence, created the perfect hunting ground for someone like the Doodler. Because victims who feared exposure were less likely to report assaults, and survivors were less likely to testify. He knew this, or at least, he took advantage of it. I find myself unsettled whenever I think about this detail, not just the violence, but the way the social climate itself enabled him to vanish into the background. The Doodler didn't just kill his victims, he hid within a culture of shame and silence that existed at the time. Imagine it. A stranger approaches you at a bar. He offers to draw your portrait. You laugh, maybe you're flattered. He sketches quickly, with a casual confidence, perhaps even a charm. You feel seen, in a way that was rare in 1974, when so much of gay life was lived in the shadows. You decide to leave with him. Perhaps you think it might lead to something more. But what waited in the darkness wasn't intimacy. It was the end. Before his first confirmed murder, police had little reason to believe that something so targeted was about to unfold. But the city was restless. There had been other killings of gay men, other attacks brushed aside. And when Gerald Kavanaugh's body was discovered, lifeless by the water, it would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Tonight, as I guide you through this case, I want you to notice the silence between words, the pauses. They echo the way so many people remained silent in those years, out of fear, out of shame, or out of mistrust. And that silence allowed a killer to thrive. The story we begin tonight will unfold piece by piece through the victims, the community, and the investigators who tried and failed to bring justice. Some parts will be difficult to hear, but they deserve to be told with honesty and care. because these men were not just victims of the Doodler. They were people with lives, dreams, and struggles. Their names deserve to be remembered. So, with the fog of San Francisco settling around us in our imaginations, let's step into January 1974, where a body washed ashore and a city would begin to realize that a predator was among them. The morning of January 27, 1974, began quietly along Ocean Beach in San Francisco. The Pacific tide was rolling in slow and gray, the sand damp with the remnants of fog. It was there that a man's body was discovered, lying face up near the waterline. His name was Gerald Kavanaugh. He was 49 years old, originally from Canada, and had been living in San Francisco. The discovery of his body was the first confirmed sign that something was terribly wrong. Kavanaugh was found fully clothed, with stab wounds to his torso. The knife had pierced deeply, several times, suggesting rage or at least determination. The wounds were clustered close together, which told investigators the killer was deliberate and controlled. Blood pooled into the sand, but the ocean tide had already washed away much of the evidence. His wallet was intact, which immediately told police this was not a robbery. The brutality, paired with the lack of theft, pointed to something more personal. The coroner's report noted defensive wounds on his hands. He had tried to fight back. His body was positioned awkwardly, suggesting he had been dragged or at least rolled after death. His shoes were wet, possibly from being near the surf before collapsing. There was no sign of sexual assault, no evidence of robbery, and yet the attack was vicious. At the time, police labeled the case as a homicide, but little more. The 1970s were not an era where crimes against gay men received the same urgency as others. Gerald Kavanaugh's death was tragic, but in the eyes of many at the time, it was also a death that could quietly disappear from headlines. I imagine Gerald walking along the beach that night, perhaps meeting someone who had offered him companionship. Perhaps this person had shown him a sketch or a quick drawing on a napkin earlier in the evening. Gerald was not found with any such paper, but we can never know if it was left behind in some unseen corner of the city. What is clear is that he trusted someone enough to spend time with them in the darkness. That trust ended with a knife in his chest. The Doodler's method was not yet visible from this single crime, but patterns began to form with the cases that followed. The use of a knife, the targeting of gay men, the meeting likely beginning in a bar or public space, and the fatal walk into isolation. Gerald was the first in a line of victims, and while his name may not have been shouted loudly in newspapers, his death marked the opening act of a killer's quiet spree. Something that still strikes me, reflecting on this first case, is the silence that followed. There was no wave of public outrage. Few headlines carried Gerald's story. In fact, for years, many people didn't even know this killing was part of something larger. He became another statistic in a city grappling with multiple types of crime. But among detectives, there was a note of unease. Homicide investigators observed that Gerald's murder felt intimate. He had not been randomly attacked on a crowded street. He had been led somewhere remote. This meant his killer had confidence. He could lure men away from safety. That detail may not seem remarkable now, but in the moment, it was the seed of a terrifying truth. The man who killed Gerald Kavanaugh would likely kill again, and he did. Over the next year, San Francisco would find itself uncovering more bodies, each marked with the same clinical violence. Knife wounds, targeted victims, no robbery. The consistency would eventually tell a story, but not soon enough to save the lives lost. Before we step further, I want to pause on something small, a detail about Gerald that was later noted by friends. He had been discreet about his sexuality. He wasn't out to everyone, and like many men of his time, he lived a quiet, careful life. And yet, even in silence, he sought connection. That desire for connection, simple, human, and natural, was what made him vulnerable to someone like the Doodler. I find that tragic in a way that lingers long after the facts are laid out. There's a strange and haunting fact here, too. In the police reports, Gerald was listed as never married. That may sound ordinary, but at the time, such a note carried weight. It often quietly indicated a man was gay. It was shorthand, a small signal hidden in bureaucratic language. Even in death, the truth of who Gerald was had to be tucked away in subtle words, rather than said plainly. That silence shaped the entire investigation, because the world in 1974 was not ready to fully confront violence against men like him. The investigation into his murder quickly lost momentum. Police interviewed a handful of people from nearby bars, but without a witness willing to testify about who Gerald had been with, the case stalled. Detectives placed the file into the growing stack of unsolved homicides. On its own, Gerald's case didn't shout, it whispered. But it was the beginning of a pattern that would scream louder with each new body. And here is where I have to leave you tonight, standing on the edge of Ocean Beach, the waves moving in and out, erasing footsteps, erasing blood. Gerald's body was the first, but it would not be the last. When the second body turned up, detectives began to sense that Gerald Kavanaugh's killing was not an isolated crime. It was June of 1974, and the victim was 27-year-old Joseph J. Stevens, a popular drag performer and comedian in San Francisco's thriving club scene. His friends described him as funny, sharp, and always ready to turn a room into a stage. Jay lived in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, and like many young men in the city at the time, he was carving out a life that embraced both his identity and his artistry. On the night of his death, Jay had been seen leaving a club. Hours later, his body was found near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and back. The violence mirrored Gerald's killing. A knife, a personal assault, no sign of robbery. His wallet was still on him. His car was parked nearby. Just like Gerald, he had been led away by someone he trusted, only for that trust to turn fatal. The parallels between the two cases unsettled investigators. Both men had met their end in isolated areas late at night. Both were gay. Both bore similar wounds. Detectives began to suspect a pattern, though in the 1970s, the word serial killer was not yet part of everyday police vocabulary. The term had only just begun to enter criminology circles, but its meaning was clear here. Someone was hunting men in San Francisco. By July of that same year, another body was discovered. This time, it was 31-year-old Klaus Christmann, a German immigrant who worked as a printer. His body was found in the same Golden Gate Park area, near a wooded trail. The brutality escalated. Klaus had been stabbed over 15 times, with wounds covering his chest, back, and face. Unlike the others, his throat had been slashed. Detectives described it as a frenzy. What chilled them even more was the absence of theft once again. His valuables had been left untouched. Patterns in homicide investigations are like fingerprints. The more they repeat, the clearer the identity of the killer becomes. And by the time Klaus was murdered, detectives had little doubt. They were dealing with one person. The wounds were consistent, the circumstances nearly identical, and the target group specific: gay men, usually approached at night. But how the killer lured his victims remained a question. Police didn't yet know the role of the sketchbook, though whispers of it would surface later from survivors. What they knew now was only that their predator was charming enough to convince strangers to walk with him into the dark. San Francisco's gay community began to feel the tension. Fear crept into late-night conversations in bars and clubs. Men warned each other about strangers. Some told friends to avoid Golden Gate Park altogether, a known meeting spot for casual encounters. Yet despite the fear, there was also silence. Many were afraid to speak openly to police, fearing exposure or harassment. One detective later noted that the investigation felt like chasing shadows in fog. They had bodies, they had patterns, but they didn't have witnesses willing to risk public testimony. And without that, all they could do was map the killings, log the details, and wait for a mistake from the killer. There's a detail in Klaus Christmann's case that has stayed with me. He had been married and had children. His death revealed a double life, one that his family may not have fully known. In the 1970s, many men carried that burden, balancing family expectations with secret lives in places like the Castro or Golden Gate Park. When Klaus's murder was reported in the papers, it was not his life that made headlines, but the insinuations about his sexuality. Even in death, his identity was framed in whispers rather than respect. Here's a strange fact from the files. Klaus had been wearing a women's jacket when he was found. No one knows why. It might have been borrowed, it might have been part of a playful night out, or it might have been a simple accident of the evening. But that detail gave the press a reason to lean into sensationalism. For investigators, however, it was just one more reminder of how easily the public dismissed victims who didn't fit into traditional expectations. The police files from this period show frustration. They had 3 homicides with nearly identical patterns, but no viable leads, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. And every time they reached out for help, survivors or acquaintances hesitated. Homophobia kept them in the shadows, and the Doodler thrived in that darkness. I sometimes imagine the killer at this point in his spree, walking the streets of the Castro, sitting in bars, sketching faces casually on napkins, smiling, watching, choosing. His victims, meanwhile, were simply seeking companionship or fun. They couldn't have imagined they were sitting across from a man who would one day be remembered in whispers as the Doodler. As 1974 turned to 1975, the murders showed no sign of stopping. A city full of life and music and protests now carried a quieter fear in its corners. The killings weren't always front-page news, but in the gay community, everyone knew. And that's where we'll pick up next, when survivors finally emerged, bringing us closer to the chilling figure behind the sketches. By early 1975, the whispers had turned into warnings. Gay men in San Francisco were talking quietly in bars and coffee shops, telling each other to be careful, to never go off alone with strangers. By now, 3 men were dead, and police suspected more. And finally, fragments of the killer's method began to surface, not through corpses, but through survivors. One man came forward, but not in a courtroom, not on the record. His name was never released publicly. He had met someone in a bar, a man who introduced himself casually with a pad of paper and a pencil. This stranger had offered to draw his portrait, a gesture that felt novel, even charming. The sketch came quickly, with confident strokes. And then, once the drawing was complete, the man had smiled, suggesting they leave together. That survivor remembered the moment things turned. They were in a quiet place, away from the buzz of the city. The sketchbook was set aside. A knife appeared. The blade flashed, and instinct took over. The survivor fought, panicked, and managed to escape, running bloodied into the night. He never pressed charges. He refused to testify. But in sharing his story quietly with detectives, he gave them the first glimpse of what the press would later call the Doodler. It was an unusual signature. Killers often leave patterns, weapons, locations, times of day. But this was different. He didn't just stab. He drew. He used art as a lure. A sketch, an intimate act, became the doorway to murder. The nickname stuck, and so did the fear it carried. At least 3 men survived encounters with the Doodler. They had been attacked, injured, but managed to flee before the knife finished its work. These survivors represented the best chance police had to catch him. And yet, each of them refused to go on the record. Why? Because they feared exposure. Some were well known in their professions. One was rumored to be a public figure with a high-profile career. To testify would mean being outed as gay in the 1970s, a risk that felt to them as devastating as death itself. I think about that a lot. In another time, perhaps they would have testified. Perhaps their voices could have stopped the killings. But in 1975, silence was a form of survival, and the Doodler knew it. He operated in a space where shame and secrecy acted like armor around him. He understood that his victims lived in a society where telling the truth came with consequences. Detectives were caught in a trap of their own. They had suspects, or at least one man they believed could be the Doodler. But without witness testimony, their hands were tied. Evidence at the time was limited. DNA testing didn't exist in the way it does now. There were no cameras in bars, no surveillance in parks. The only way to secure a conviction was through testimony, and no one would speak. The details from the survivor accounts are eerie in their consistency. A young black man, slender, between 19 and 25 years old. He carried a sketch pad. He approached men in bars, diners, or clubs, sometimes in the Castro, sometimes in Tenderloin. He would strike up casual conversation, often offering a drawing. Then, when the moment was right, he attacked with a knife. That image, a predator who begins with a pencil and ends with a blade, is one of the most haunting aspects of this case. The drawing was not just a gimmick. It was a mask, a way of disarming his targets. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. There's a strange fact hidden in these reports. The sketches themselves were never recovered. No surviving portrait has ever been connected to the Doodler. We don't know what he drew. Were they crude, quick outlines, or were they detailed, almost professional? The absence of these sketches leaves a chilling gap, as if pieces of the killer's shadow art once existed but vanished with his victims. Police work in this era was grinding. Detectives knocked on doors, canvassed bars, and leaned on contacts in the gay community. But fear made people wary. Men who might have known something kept their distance. The police, after all, were not always allies. In fact, many gay men in the 1970s had experienced harassment or raids from law enforcement themselves. So trusting them enough to give names felt impossible. The Doodler thrived in that tension. He knew his victims were isolated, caught between danger on one side and silence on the other. He killed in that space, knowing his crimes would never ignite a firestorm of headlines, that his name would not be shouted on front pages. By the time 1975 ended, more men had died, and survivors continued to whisper, but not testify. The Doodler remained faceless to the public, a ghost sketching in bars, then vanishing into the fog of San Francisco nights. Before I carry you further into this grim story, let me pause here and speak to you, my listeners. We're only just entering the heart of this case, and it's chilling to know that what we've covered so far was only the beginning. If you're still with me, if you want to keep walking with me deeper into stories that history itself tried to bury, then go ahead, tap the like button, subscribe, and stay close. And while you're here, tell me something in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight, and what's the time on your clock right now? It always amazes me how this circle of listeners connects across time zones. Now, we move onward. Because even with the nickname the Doodler, the killings didn't stop. They grew bolder, and the city's fear grew sharper. By mid-1975, the air in San Francisco's Castro district was heavy with unease. The Doodler had already claimed multiple lives, and though police were aware, the community itself was the one truly living under the shadow. You could feel it in the bars, where conversations dropped when strangers walked in. You could feel it in the parks at night, where men who once laughed and lingered now moved quickly, scanning over their shoulders. Fear had settled into the heart of a community that had only just begun to feel safe. The Castro was more than just a neighborhood. It was a refuge. Men from across the country came here, escaping families that rejected them, towns that condemned them. In San Francisco, they found solidarity, companionship, even love. But when the Doodler began striking, that fragile sense of belonging felt threatened. He wasn't killing just individuals. He was dismantling trust. Police investigations were slow, often detached. And for many in the gay community, that distance wasn't surprising. The 1970s were years when law enforcement often raided gay bars, arrested men for public indecency, and treated queer lives as less valuable. So when detectives knocked on doors and asked questions about the killings, many residents hesitated to respond. The victims were mourned quietly, but with an undercurrent of resignation. Perhaps justice would never come. It's important to pause here and remember the cultural context. Homosexuality was still classified as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association until 1973, just 1 year before the first Doodler murder. Police attitudes, shaped by decades of prejudice, were not easily shifted. So, in a cruel irony, the very system meant to protect people was one they couldn't fully trust. The Doodler thrived in this tension. He was not a ghost or a phantom. He was a man walking among them, blending into the very spaces that were supposed to be safe. Witnesses described him as young, quiet, sometimes shy, but approachable. A sketch pad in hand, a smile. Nothing threatening at first glance. The Castro, once a place where people relaxed, now felt like hunting grounds. One story told by locals has stayed with me. A bartender recalled that after the killings began, customers started keeping mental notes of strangers who drew or who carried sketchbooks. The act of sketching, once innocent, became tinged with suspicion. Imagine that. An artist at a bar, drawing casually, now seen through a lens of fear. The Doodler had taken something as harmless as art and twisted it into a weapon of distrust. The murders also highlighted a broader issue: how violence against marginalized groups was often minimized. The press coverage of the Doodler killings was sparse compared to other crimes of the era. Front pages filled with stories of Zodiac years earlier, or political scandals, while these killings received only fragmented attention. For the men who lived in the Castro, it reinforced a painful truth: that their lives, in the eyes of the city's power structures, mattered less. And yet, within the community itself, there was resilience. Friends organized informal safety groups, warning others about suspicious men. Flyers circulated in bars, discreetly reminding patrons not to leave with strangers. It wasn't an organized movement, not yet, but it was survival through solidarity. A strange fact from the time: despite the fear, nightlife in the Castro didn't die. Men still went out, still danced, still met one another. For many, the danger was secondary to the need to live authentically, even briefly. In a way, it's a reminder of how resilience often coexists with terror. People still sought connection, even knowing the risks. Detectives noticed the shift too. They knew the community was talking, but few were willing to go on record. This frustrated investigators, but it was also the reality of policing a group that had been criminalized for years. To them, the silence wasn't a mystery. It was self-preservation. One officer later reflected that the Doodler was the perfect predator for his time. He chose victims who were unlikely to report him, who feared exposure more than death. That assessment is chilling because it's true. He weaponized not just his knife, but the social climate itself. By the summer of 1975, police knew they were chasing someone who might never be caught without cooperation. But how could they demand cooperation from a community that felt betrayed by them for decades? That paradox became the central flaw in the investigation. As the year dragged on, the city of San Francisco found itself carrying two truths: the joy of a flourishing gay culture and the dread of a killer hiding in plain sight. For every parade or march, there was a funeral. For every laugh in a bar, there was a whispered warning. This was the tension of San Francisco in those years. Liberation shadowed by death, and the Doodler was the silent presence threading through it all. By the fall of 1975, detectives had more than a handful of bodies. But what disturbed them most were the stories that trickled in from men who had survived the Doodler. These weren't just rumors whispered in bars. These were direct encounters with the killer that, had the victims been willing to testify, might have ended the nightmare years earlier. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Doodler case is that there were at least 3 confirmed survivors, men who had let their guard down, who had gone home with the artist, only to be attacked when the knife appeared. They escaped, shaken but alive, and yet not one of them would go to court. One survivor was said to be a public figure, a well-known entertainer whose name appeared in newspapers and on television. Another was reportedly a diplomat, someone whose career depended on discretion. The third was an ordinary man, but one whose family did not know he was gay. Each faced the same impossible choice: speak up and risk exposure in a society that punished homosexuality, or remain silent and let a killer walk free. They chose silence. This silence became the defining obstacle of the case. Detectives knew the identity of the man they believed was responsible. They questioned him more than once. They even had descriptions that matched, sketches drawn, and a trail of accounts that pointed in his direction. But the law required witnesses, and the witnesses, for reasons that made painful sense, were unwilling. One strange fact: according to police records, one survivor actually sat across from the suspected Doodler in a lineup and identified him without hesitation. And yet, when asked to testify in court, he withdrew. The risk of having his private life splashed across headlines outweighed his desire for justice. This raises a deep scholarly debate that criminologists and historians still return to. Should victims of crime, especially in marginalized communities, bear the burden of risking their lives and reputations for the sake of prosecution? Some argue that without testimony, justice cannot function. The system requires courage, however unfair. Others counter that expecting marginalized victims to put themselves in danger in order to validate a justice system that already failed them is an additional act of cruelty. For the Doodler, this silence became a shield. The police could not build a case strong enough to withstand trial, so he was never charged. The irony was bitter. Everyone knew who he was, and yet he remained free. The survivors carried their secrets for decades. Imagine the weight of that. Knowing you had looked into the eyes of a killer, knowing your words could have saved others, but also knowing that those same words might destroy your life. That moral knot is something most of us will thankfully never face. The Doodler, meanwhile, adapted. Detectives believed he altered his behavior after realizing that not all of his victims were dying. Some managed to fight back, to run, to scream loud enough to scare him off. These failed attacks seemed to make him more cautious, more selective. In the span of just over a year, his spree slowed, then appeared to stop. But the survivors, they lived in constant fear. One recalled, years later, that he never again allowed a stranger into his home. Another moved away entirely, erasing any trace of his connection to San Francisco. Their silence had saved their reputations, but it had also imprisoned them in lives shaped by what they couldn't say. And the community knew too. Word spread about the survivors who wouldn't testify. It created resentment in some circles. Why should one man's reputation matter more than another man's life? But for others, there was only empathy. In those days, being outed wasn't just socially inconvenient. It could mean losing a job, a home, even your family. It was, in some ways, its own kind of death. Detectives admitted privately that their hands were tied. They could only circle the suspect, interview him, let him go. Each release was another wound to the community, another reminder that justice was conditional. It is chilling to think of this. In a city where men were being stabbed and left near beaches and parks, the police had a name, a face, even testimony, and still the killer walked among them. The Doodler's victims lived at the intersection of two brutal realities, the violence of the knife and the violence of silence. One was physical, the other social. Together, they ensured that justice would never truly be served. By the end of 1975, the police investigation was stalled, and the surviving men carried the unbearable truth that their voices might have ended it all, but that speaking would have destroyed them too. The year turned, and by early 1976, something strange happened. The killings seemed to stop. At first, police dared to hope that the Doodler had moved on, maybe even been arrested on unrelated charges. But in the gay community, the quiet wasn't peace, it was tension. A silence that felt temporary, like the calm before a storm. You see, killers rarely stop of their own accord, and when they do, it's often for reasons out of their control. That truth weighed heavily on detectives in San Francisco. The Doodler's case had gone cold, and without new bodies or new witnesses, there was little they could do. Still, the city carried scars. Bars in the Castro grew warier. Conversations that once flowed freely became guarded, as men weighed every glance, every stranger's smile. Nightlife dimmed with suspicion. Some clubs even kept informal lists of men rumored to be dangerous, though none of these warnings could name the Doodler outright. It wasn't just about fear of the knife. It was about being seen. Walking into a gay bar in 1976 could still be enough to ruin a career if the wrong eyes noticed. Many men told detectives they'd rather risk a killer than risk exposure. That social trap created an almost perfect hunting ground for someone like the Doodler. One unusual fact I came across while digging into this case: police officers in San Francisco admitted years later that some patrolmen considered the killings low priority because of who the victims were. In the 1970s, murders of gay men didn't carry the same urgency inside the department as murders of so-called respectable citizens. That's not conjecture. It's written in historical accounts of the case. It's a reminder of how systemic prejudice can warp justice itself. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether serial killers like the Doodler deliberately exploit systemic biases, consciously or unconsciously. Some criminologists argue that predators learn quickly. They pick targets least likely to draw police attention. Others suggest the killer's choices are driven by personal compulsion, and any overlap with marginalized groups is coincidental. With the Doodler, the evidence leans heavily towards strategy. He didn't just kill gay men, he killed gay men who were unlikely to be publicly defended. By the late 1970s, the city was moving into a new era. Harvey Milk was on the rise as a political figure, and visibility of the LGBTQ+ community began to shift. Yet, in police files, the Doodler case collected dust. The suspect remained free, known but untouchable. Some officers who had worked the case quietly retired, frustrated that bureaucracy and stigma had prevented them from closing in. Meanwhile, whispers continued. People believed the Doodler was still in the city, perhaps even sitting in cafes, sketchbook in hand, just as before. There were no new bodies, but for survivors and for those who had lost friends, the idea of him walking unnoticed among them was unbearable. This was the paradox. Without fresh crimes, the case lost momentum. But for the community, the killer's absence didn't mean safety. It meant uncertainty. Had he really stopped, or was he just waiting? Sometimes what frightens us most isn't the violence we see. It's the violence we know could return at any moment. And in San Francisco, that threat hung like fog. As the years rolled into the 1980s, San Francisco was changing. The city that had once been a haven for dreamers and outsiders was now grappling with a new crisis: the AIDS epidemic. Fear of disease dominated headlines, shifted police resources, and reshaped public discourse. In the shadow of that crisis, the Doodler case slipped further into obscurity. For the men who remembered 1974 and 1975, though, the memories didn't fade. Every unsolved murder leaves behind what detectives sometimes call a living case file. Not just papers and photographs, but people who carry the weight of unfinished business. The Doodler's survivors, those who had barely escaped, were among them. And so were the families of the victims, who rarely saw their sons' or brothers' names in print again. The police knew exactly how fragile the case had become. Evidence was sparse, and even what they had, crime scene reports, autopsy findings, witness sketches, was deteriorating, both physically and in terms of usefulness. Witnesses moved away. Some died. Some forgot details, the way memory always does after years pass. One unusual detail about this period. In 1977, just a couple of years after the killings stopped, police publicly acknowledged that they had questioned a man they believed could be the Doodler. They didn't release his name, but newspapers at the time reported that he was cooperative, even polite, when interviewed. Imagine that. The man suspected of stabbing multiple strangers to death, calmly answering questions in a police station, knowing full well the system had no teeth without witnesses willing to testify. It's chilling in its own quiet way. The debate among criminologists here is fascinating. Some argue that killers who suddenly stop are rare outliers, anomalies who don't fit the typical serial predator pattern. Others suggest they don't really stop at all. They just get better at hiding or shift their crimes in ways that no longer fit their original profile. With the Doodler, no one truly knows. Did he stop killing entirely? Or did he simply find victims who would never be traced back to him? During the 1980s, the Castro neighborhood was battling different wars against prejudice, against disease, against political neglect. The Doodler's crimes were almost ghosts, fading into the city's collective subconscious. And yet, detectives occasionally revisited the case files, hoping something might stir. One retired officer later admitted that every time a young man turned up dead in the Bay Area under suspicious circumstances, he wondered, is this him again? But the cases never matched closely enough to reopen the official investigation. I often think about the families of the Doodler's victims during this era. Imagine writing letters, year after year, asking the police for updates and hearing only silence or the faint rustle of pages in an old folder. Closure was not just delayed, it was denied. By the end of the decade, the Doodler had become more of a legend than a living threat. People who had been in their 20s during his spree were now in their 30s and 40s. Newcomers to San Francisco barely knew the story at all. The city's identity had shifted so much that it seemed like something out of another lifetime. But the file was still there. And somewhere, the suspect was still alive, still uncharged, still carrying his secrets. When detectives looked back, they saw not only missed opportunities, but a painful reminder of how prejudice had crippled justice. And that truth, that injustice, would come roaring back decades later when the case was finally reopened. For now, though, in the 1980s, the silence was complete. The Doodler was gone, but never forgotten. By the 1990s, San Francisco had transformed yet again. The tech boom was beginning to ripple through the Bay Area, reshaping the economy and the culture. But in the quiet corridors of the police department, the Doodler's case still sat in its box, labeled and shelved, its contents slowly yellowing with age. Cold cases are like shadows. They never disappear, but they don't always demand attention either. Detectives inherit them the way one might inherit an old family heirloom, with duty, but not always with passion. Still, every now and then, a fresh pair of eyes would open the Doodler file, skim the witness statements, look at the crime scene sketches, and ask, what if we had one more piece of evidence? And here's the thing. The 1990s brought a revolution in forensic science: DNA analysis. Suddenly, evidence that had been considered useless in the 1970s and 1980s could now tell stories. Blood, hair, fibers, all could be analyzed in ways unimaginable 2 decades earlier. Police quietly began reviewing their old cases, sending samples to labs. And while the Doodler's crimes were too old and too poorly preserved to yield clear results at first, the very existence of DNA technology rekindled hope. Detectives knew that someday, if the evidence survived long enough, science might speak where witnesses had remained silent. One unusual fact: the Doodler investigation had preserved certain items that seemed trivial at the time: cigarette butts, drink glasses, even a few sketches. Back in the 1970s, these had little forensic value, but by the 1990s, they were treated like gold, sealed, and sent to evidence rooms with renewed care. It was almost poetic, the idea that objects once overlooked might hold the answers everyone had been waiting for. But here lies the academic debate. Criminologists and legal scholars often ask, does reopening old cases decades later truly serve justice? On one side, the argument is simple. Murder has no statute of limitations, and families deserve closure no matter how much time has passed. On the other side, memory fades, evidence degrades, and trials conducted decades after a crime can be fragile, sometimes even unfair. Would convicting a man in his 60s or 70s for crimes he allegedly committed in his 20s provide real justice? Or is it simply symbolic, a way for society to soothe its conscience? For the Doodler, these questions weren't abstract. Detectives were still quietly circling the same suspect they had questioned back in 1976. He was older now, living quietly, far from the headlines. Some officers admitted privately that they saw him as a man who had gotten away with it. But DNA gave them a new weapon, and they weren't ready to let it go. Through the 1990s, no major breakthrough came, but the groundwork was being laid. Evidence was being cataloged. Technology was advancing every year. It was only a matter of time before science and persistence collided. Meanwhile, the gay community of San Francisco had changed dramatically. What once was whispered fear in the bars of the Castro had turned into activism, visibility, and political power. Yet the memory of the Doodler lingered among older men who had lived through those nights of terror. They remembered friends who never came home, and they remembered the silence that had allowed a killer to vanish. By the time the decade closed, the Doodler was more myth than man. But in police files, he remained very real. He had not been caught. He had not been charged. And the city still carried his shadow. The stage was set for the case to rise again. Not because of new crimes, but because technology had finally caught up to the questions left unanswered in the 1970s. The 2000s arrived with a new sense of possibility in law enforcement. Cold case units were expanding across the United States, many driven by advances in DNA technology. What had once been a frustrating dead end was now a fresh frontier. Detectives who had spent their careers stymied by cases like the Doodler were suddenly reinvigorated. In San Francisco, the Doodler's file was pulled from storage once again. This time, the goal wasn't just to review witness statements or redraw timelines. It was to retest every single piece of physical evidence collected between 1974 and 1975. Evidence bags that had sat in boxes for over 25 years were opened carefully. Fibers, cigarette ends, clothing, even swabs from the victims' bodies, everything was cataloged for forensic re-examination. And though the public didn't hear about it at the time, detectives began to believe they were closing in. The suspect they had questioned in the 1970s was still alive, still living in California, still very much within reach. But they needed science to give them the connection that testimony never had. Here's a strange fact from the reinvestigation. One of the surviving victims, now an older man, was quietly re-interviewed by police. This time, he was more open about his ordeal, though still hesitant to go public. Times had changed. Being gay in the 2000s was no longer the same social risk it had been in the 1970s. But for a man who had lived his whole life with secrecy, the habit of silence was hard to break. Detectives walked away frustrated, but they noted how much had shifted. Society itself had finally moved, even if justice had not. This brings us to a scholarly debate that fits perfectly here. How much does changing cultural context reshape old investigations? Criminologists argue that cases like the Doodler are unique because they exist at the intersection of crime and prejudice. In the 1970s, the law couldn't function properly because witnesses feared exposure. In the 2000s, with gay rights gaining visibility, those barriers weakened, but decades of silence had already crippled the case. Was it the same investigation anymore? Or was it now something else, filtered through years of changing attitudes? Detectives didn't care much for philosophy. For them, the mission was clear. Prove it, even if it's 30 years late. And they were convinced they could. The lab results, however, came back murkier than expected. Some samples were degraded, too old for clear DNA profiles. Others offered partial matches, but nothing definitive. Science had promised answers, but it hadn't delivered the clean resolution everyone hoped for. Still, the case wasn't abandoned. In fact, it gained quiet traction behind the scenes. Detectives kept circling the suspect, watching his life unfold. They knew he had been a young man in San Francisco during the mid-70s. They knew he matched survivor descriptions. They knew he had been interviewed at least twice in the original investigation. And yet, without the missing link, they couldn't move forward. By the end of the 2000s, the Doodler was once again a file on a desk, a haunting reminder of what couldn't be proven. But the world was changing faster than ever. By 2010, open discussion about cold cases and true crime was flourishing in the public sphere. Podcasts, documentaries, and online communities were pulling forgotten cases back into the light. And when that happened, the Doodler's name began to resurface in ways it hadn't for decades. For the families, for the survivors, for the city, the sense was the same. Maybe, just maybe, the window of silence was finally cracking open. By the 2010s, true crime had become part of popular culture. Podcasts, documentaries, and endless online forums were dissecting cases both solved and unsolved. And in that renewed attention, the Doodler's name surfaced again. People who had never lived in San Francisco during the 1970s were suddenly reading about the case online, asking questions, demanding to know why a serial killer had slipped away unpunished. This public curiosity mattered. Cold cases often live or die based on how much pressure the public applies. For decades, the Doodler had been a whispered story in the Castro, a shadow in San Francisco's memory. Now, he was becoming a subject of national curiosity. Detectives noticed. The San Francisco Police Department officially reopened the case around 2018. This time, they weren't just revisiting files. They were leaning heavily on modern forensic tools like familial DNA searches and digital databases that hadn't existed before. The hope was that even a degraded sample might, through family links, point them back to the man they'd suspected all along. A fascinating and unusual detail. When the department publicly acknowledged the reopening, they did something rare. They released a composite sketch of the suspect. Not as he looked in 1975, but as he might look decades later, aged and weathered. It was an attempt to jar memories, to encourage tips from anyone who might have crossed paths with him in recent years. It was also a reminder that killers don't vanish. They age. They change. They carry their pasts with them. And here lies another important scholarly debate. Does reopening a cold case after 40 years truly serve the community, or does it reopen old wounds for families who have tried to move forward? Some criminologists argue that closure is never really possible, that justice delayed is justice denied. Others counter that even late accountability is essential because it validates the value of the lives lost. In the Doodler's case, those questions were not abstract. They played out in the lives of the victims' families, many of whom were now elderly or had passed away, leaving siblings, nieces, and nephews to carry the memory. Police confirmed they still had a suspect. In fact, they hinted that they had long believed they knew who the Doodler was. The problem was never identity, it was evidence. Without testimony or irrefutable DNA, prosecutors feared the case would collapse in court. To put an old man on trial and lose would be worse than never trying at all. And yet, the symbolism of those press releases mattered. For the LGBTQ+ community, it was an acknowledgement that the city's institutions had failed them in the 1970s and were finally trying to make amends. The case was no longer just about catching a killer. It was about rewriting the narrative of neglect. In 2019, detectives publicly offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the Doodler's capture. That move was as much about visibility as it was about leads. It sent a message: we care, even if it's late. But justice remained elusive. The suspect was never charged. By then, he was elderly, living quietly, never having faced trial for the crimes that haunted San Francisco for decades. For me, the most haunting part of this chapter is the image of that aged composite sketch. It's one thing to imagine a young man with a sketch pad and a knife in 1975. It's another to imagine him as an old man, living in plain sight, carrying the knowledge of what he had done. Time had not erased the crimes. It had only blurred their outlines. The Doodler was still free. But his shadow had returned to the city he once terrorized. When the case was reopened in 2018, many of the surviving detectives who had worked it in the 1970s were long retired, but their memories remained vivid. Some of them spoke publicly for the first time, describing their frustrations and regrets. They admitted that they had always known who the likely killer was. They had questioned him more than once. They had even brought survivors into lineups where he was identified. But every time, the testimony collapsed under the weight of fear and stigma, and so the Doodler slipped away. By 2020, with DNA technology advancing rapidly, San Francisco police began exploring every option. Familial DNA searches, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, were applied to the old samples. Detectives hoped that even if the suspect himself wasn't in a database, perhaps a relative was. But degradation of evidence remained the enemy. Time, humidity, and poor preservation had left their marks. Some samples were inconclusive, some contaminated. Still, there were glimmers of progress. Police quietly confirmed that they had identified the Doodler as a man who had once been a psychiatric patient in the Bay Area. The detail was small, but it reinforced what survivors had said back in the 1970s, that he seemed quiet, intense, troubled. Forensic psychologists began speculating about his motives. One unusual fact: some believed that the Doodler's choice to sketch his victims first wasn't just a lure. It might have been part of the ritual itself, a way of asserting control, of freezing the victim on paper before attacking. It's a theory supported by parallels in other serial crimes, where killers created tokens, drawings, or even recordings. The sketchbook was not incidental, it was central. And here lies a deep academic debate. Criminologists argue over whether serial killers are ever truly curable, whether psychiatric treatment could have altered the Doodler's path had he been caught early. Some suggest that untreated mental illness, combined with social stigma, created the conditions for his violence. Others counter that labeling killers as sick risks excusing deliberate acts of cruelty. With the Doodler, the truth remains murky. But the possibility that he was institutionalized before or after his crimes has haunted investigators for decades. By 2021, San Francisco police renewed their appeal to the public, highlighting that the suspect was still alive in his 70s, living quietly. They did not name him, but the implication was clear. Justice was still possible. And yet, prosecutors hesitated. Without airtight DNA or a willing witness, the case could collapse. For the families of the victims, this was both hopeful and agonizing. Imagine being told that the man who killed your brother or your son was still alive, identifiable, even locatable, but untouchable in the eyes of the law. Some relatives pushed for charges, saying that the risk of acquittal was worth it. Others said that after 40 years, reopening the wounds without certainty of conviction would be cruelty. The community, too, was divided. For many older LGBTQ plus San Franciscans, the Doodler case symbolized decades of police neglect. To see it revisited was validating, but also bitter. Why now, when so many who had lived through it were already gone? The Doodler himself, if he followed the news, would have seen his own face age progressed and plastered across headlines. Imagine that, living into old age unpunished, yet suddenly reminded that the past had not forgotten him. Did he feel fear, regret, pride? We will never know. The strange silence of the Doodler case, killings that seemed to stop as suddenly as they started, remains one of its most haunting features. Did he stop voluntarily? Did something in his life change? Or did he simply get better at hiding the bodies? These questions linger, unanswered, drifting between fact and speculation. By the early 2020s, the Doodler had become not just a case, but a symbol of silence, of stigma, of justice delayed. And the city waited to see if science or courage would finally close the story. By 2022, the case entered a new stage of visibility. The San Francisco Police Department offered a $200,000 reward for information leading to the Doodler's arrest and conviction. The size of the reward alone underscored the gravity of the case, not just for law enforcement, but for a city still reckoning with its past. Flyers were distributed, age-progressed sketches circulated, and the case was spotlighted in documentaries and true crime podcasts. Suddenly, the Doodler was a name again, whispered in cafes and discussed in academic seminars. Detectives revealed that they had interviewed the prime suspect as recently as the 1970s and had tracked him through the decades. But here was the cruel irony. The justice system, designed to protect both victims and suspects, required evidence beyond doubt. Without living witnesses willing to testify, without intact DNA, the case would crumble in court. The suspect would walk free, perhaps emboldened. Prosecutors were faced with a dilemma: pursue justice imperfectly or preserve the chance of someday delivering it properly. Meanwhile, scholars of criminal justice raised another debate. Is justice delayed the same as justice denied? In the Doodler case, many victims were never publicly named. Families lived with shame or secrecy, unwilling to admit that their loved ones had been found in cruising spots, or that they were gay at all. This erasure, intentional or not, deepened the wound. Historians argue that the Doodler case is not only a crime story, but also a social story, showing how prejudice can strangle justice as surely as a weapon. Here's one strange fact. In some reports, investigators suggested that the suspect himself may have been gay but self-hating, torn between desire and disgust. This internal conflict, coupled with mental illness, might have fueled his violence. Yet, critics caution against oversimplification. Not all self-hatred leads to homicide, and not all killers have such motives. Still, the idea has fascinated psychologists, raising the unsettling question of how identity, repression, and violence can intertwine. The renewed investigation also highlighted the changes in how police relate to marginalized communities. In the 1970s, the gay community and law enforcement were adversaries. By the 2020s, the police worked with LGBTQ+ groups to encourage tips. This shift was not just procedural, it was cultural, born from decades of activism and loss. Some older gay men saw it as bittersweet progress. The help they had needed back then was now available, but far too late for their friends. As the search for answers continued, the suspect's anonymity loomed like a ghost. He was alive, said police. He was living in California. But beyond that, silence. Rumors swirled. Was he in a nursing home? Was he watching the coverage on TV? Did neighbors know who he was? The thought that the Doodler could be sitting quietly among ordinary people added an extra layer of dread. The weight of the case also shifted toward memory. Survivors, some in their 70s themselves, began speaking publicly, telling stories they had kept secret for decades. Their voices were soft, sometimes halting, but determined. They described his soft-spoken demeanor, the pencil and pad, the sudden eruption of violence. Their testimony served as both evidence and catharsis, a way to reclaim their narratives from silence. Still, the law remained stubborn. Without their willingness to stand in court, without ironclad forensic proof, the case sat in limbo. And time was running out, not just for the suspect, but for the city itself, eager to resolve a wound that had lingered nearly half a century. The Doodler's story was no longer just a mystery. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting fear, prejudice, and the frailty of justice when silence becomes the dominant voice. By 2023, journalists began pressing harder. Who was the suspect, and why was his name still withheld? Some news outlets hinted that the man had lived a relatively ordinary life after the killings, working, paying taxes, blending into society. The thought was chilling. While families mourned and a city whispered, the Doodler may have been quietly shopping for groceries, chatting with neighbors, living unnoticed in the background. The official explanation for the silence was frustratingly simple. To name him without charges could jeopardize the case. But unofficially, some suspected that the embarrassment of failure, the fact that police had questioned him in the 1970s and let him go, made authorities cautious. Forensic psychologists continued dissecting his possible mindset. Some argued that the abrupt end to the murders suggested a trigger in his life. Perhaps he was institutionalized. Perhaps he relocated. Or, darker still, perhaps he continued killing but changed his methods. The absence of bodies doesn't always mean the absence of violence. One strange fact emerged from archival digging. The sketching itself may have been an anchor ritual. In behavioral profiling, some killers need a repetitive act to stabilize their control over the situation. For the Doodler, sitting quietly, drawing his victims before the attack, may have provided that anchor. It wasn't just a ruse. It was part of the psychological structure of the crime. Academics also debated whether the Doodler should be viewed as a singular aberration or as part of a larger historical pattern. The 1970s saw a surge of serial killings across the U.S., many targeting marginalized groups. Some criminologists suggest that social upheaval, the clash of liberation movements with lingering conservatism, created fertile ground for predators. Others counter that this is too deterministic, that killers exploit opportunities regardless of the cultural moment. The Doodler in this framing is both unique and emblematic, a product of his time, but also an individual making horrifying choices. For the families, however, these debates offered little comfort. Some relatives began holding small, private memorials. They lit candles, read names aloud, reclaimed dignity for men whose deaths had once been hidden in shame. In their grief, they created visibility, ensuring the victims were not remembered as just statistics in a police file. San Francisco itself had changed dramatically. The areas where the Doodler once hunted were now gentrified, polished, expensive. Yet in certain corners, the memory lingered. Older residents could still point to alleys and parks, saying softly, "That's where they found him." The past haunted the landscape, visible only to those who knew where to look. The suspect, unnamed, uncharged, loomed like a shadow over the story. As of today, he remains alive, elderly, perhaps frail. Some argue that prosecuting him at this stage would be symbolic more than punitive. But symbols matter. For survivors, for the families of the dead, for a community once silenced, the symbol of accountability might mean everything. The Doodler case thus rests in a peculiar state, both open and unresolved, known and unknown, a story that could end at any moment with a charge, a confession, or a death. And until then, it hovers, half-closed, an echo of the 1970s reverberating through the present. The case of the Doodler ends not with a triumphant courtroom scene, but with silence. For nearly 50 years, this story has remained incomplete. We know who the suspect is, a man once questioned, identified, and quietly released. We know he is still alive, though elderly now, and yet no jury has ever heard his name. No judge has ever spoken his sentence. Why? Because the evidence, even today, remains fragile. Witnesses who once survived his attacks refused to testify in the 1970s, fearing that outing themselves as gay men would destroy their lives. By the time attitudes shifted and society grew more open, time had already eroded memories, and key witnesses had passed away. What might have been damning testimony in 1975 became faint recollection decades later. The killer's freedom was not secured by cunning or brilliance, but by silence, both forced and chosen. The official verdict, then, is absence. No trial, no conviction, no prison cell. The suspect walks free to this day, protected not by innocence, but by the legal gap that grew wider with every passing year. And yet, the punishment exists in another form. The Doodler lives not as a celebrated man, but as a shadow. His name is hidden in police files, known to journalists but unprinted. He has outlived his victims, yes, but he has also outlived his chance to be anything other than what he was. His story belongs to the history of serial killers, forever tied to fear, secrecy, and injustice. That is his legacy, to be remembered not as a man, but as a wound. For the families of the dead, the ending is bitter. Some found a measure of peace in speaking their loved ones' names aloud after years of enforced silence. Others never healed. The city itself moved on, but the community never forgot. The Doodler may have avoided court, but he could not erase his crimes from memory. As I close this story, I want to slow down the pace, because I know how heavy it feels to sit with a case that has no proper ending. It leaves you unsettled, unsatisfied, maybe even angry. But remember, the act of listening, of keeping these names alive, is itself a kind of justice. Every time we tell the story, the victims are remembered, and the silence that once protected their killer is broken. So, take a breath with me now. The city of San Francisco is no longer the same place it was in 1974. The streets where fear once lingered are different. The voices that were silenced now echo louder than ever. And though this case never reached a courtroom, it teaches us something about the cost of silence and the need for every voice to be heard. I'll leave you here, in the quiet, with the thought that even unresolved stories matter. The victims mattered, their lives mattered, and you've carried their memory with me tonight. This case ends here. I wish you a peaceful night's